Okay, on to Photoshop for the rest of the course. First I wanted to mention here, this is the photos I'll be using for the class. This is session 1 and 2. For today, session 1, I wanted to go over more of the traditional type photography. Obviously it's Photoshop, that's not maybe traditional, but what I mean by that is Photoshop as a darkroom. You know, nothing fancy like you know, making an older person look younger or anything like that. That will be the next session. So we'll cover, you know, removing chromatic aberrations, lens distortion, fine-tuning the hue. One thing that I guess is a little more Photoshopish, or you know, not as traditional. Today we'll cover auto blending and auto stitching photos together. But you know, everything related to tricks on contrast level, sharpening, detail, all of that we'll try to go over today. In addition, file formats, I'll just mention that right now before we get into it. There are raw files, which is an advantage if your DSLR can take raw imagery, raw images. And you know, there's a lot more information, a lot more megabytes as well in a raw file than there is in, say, for instance, even a TIFF file, or especially a JPEG. So you know, JPEGs have a lot of compression. They're great for the internet because they're so small, but they're very compressed. And I'm sure everybody's, you know, had the experience there. If you zoom into a JPEG on the internet, it looks very rough and grainy, and there's a lot of artifacts, they call them, in them. So anyway, back to raw files. There's more than one format of raw. You know, there's more than one raw format. For instance, you could have a DNG file. You could also have a PEF file if you have a Pentax camera. And I found out quickly that the PEF extension .pef is not recognized by Adobe Photoshop. So I can open it in a program called Photomatics, which I use for HDR photography. We'll talk about that later. But I couldn't open it in Photoshop. So that was a limitation, was a problem. I just, you know, switched it over in camera. Yeah, I could switch it over to the DNG format, and then it was fine. Maybe other cameras might have their own format as well. I'm not as familiar with, you know, other digital cameras, other brands. I have had some non-digital cameras of other brands, but not so much digital. So just keep that in mind. As far as raw files, a little more on raw files. They, like I was saying, a lot more information, a lot more color information as well. And as you'll see here in a second, when you open up a raw file in Photoshop, there's a lot you can do with it as far as sharpening it more precisely. You can, well, let's go ahead and look at that right now. So I'm going to open up this image right here. I entitled the little folder, I don't know if I can pull this up, pretty long title, getting a photo to look as good as what you saw and maybe a little better. So that's kind of our goal here. You open it up in Photoshop, and a raw file you have to keep in mind. Now it's different if you have your camera set to be taking JPEGs, even, you know, high resolution JPEGs. It you know, you can tweak how much saturation there is in the JPEG, how much sharpening, how much contrast. All of those settings, none of them apply to a raw image normally. It's just right out of the camera. No matter how much you tweak those or adjust those in your camera, it's not going to affect your raw. If you have it set to raw raw imagery, it's just none of that applies. All of that has to do with the compression and adjustments in a JPEG. And that's essentially what you're going to be doing here. You're going to be manually putting on, you know, based on the particular image, what you want to do as far as, you know, saturation or contrast and all those other things I just mentioned. So this is not quite as good as I pictured it in my mind when I was looking at it. It's pretty close. I think I'm going to actually make it look a little bit better maybe than what I saw in person, but it's going to be pretty close. And right now it's a little bit grayer. This is more washed out, these clouds are, than what I could see in person. It was fairly glaring though. was a fairly bright day. There had been just a background story. There had been a storm earlier, and it had cleared, and it's near the afternoon. Okay, so one of the first things we could do is adjust the temperature. You have some presets here. Right now it's set to custom. This, I believe, is what I set to what I used on the last photo I tweaked in here, so it's probably set to that. But as shot, click that right there, and I think it made it a little bit bluer, you can see. Some of these, for instance, recovery is already bumped up to 100. You can see how washed out it is when it's all the way down. So yeah, we'll want to bump that all the way up to 100 in this case. So a lot of these settings are actually what I've, like I said, previously had, so it might not be a good look at how it looked raw right out of the camera because there's already some presets here. So keep that in mind. You know, your raw image might look pretty raw or rough, in other words, but there's a lot you can do with it, with all of the visual information you have to work with. So you could try auto. Let's see what that looks like. I'm going to do something, tweak it custom in a minute, but I'm just letting you look at these. That's more yellow. Temperature is pretty high, 6350. Daylight, that's what you know, the sun is set at pretty much and everything. Well, it turns out pretty blue. I'm going to knock that back just a little bit. Let's make it 5300, or make it a little bluer, but I'm going to also tweak the green to magenta, so it's quite a bit, so it's on the other, and it's -13. So that looks kind of fits what I was envisioning, you might say. I'm just going to go through these quickly now. I usually take a while kind of, you know, tweaking and going back and tweaking again and adjusting, looking at it. Sometimes I might even go back to an image later, come back, sit back down and look at it again. But, you know, the quicker you can work, the better, but you want to make it look good still. So, let's see, let's make this fill light 12. That's going to fill in some of these darker areas, obviously. Black. Usually you want to have something in the black, but this one, it looks like it's doing okay with it set at 0. 5, I believe, is the default. Okay, let's keep the brightness at 11. Contrast, let's make that -10. I don't often put the contrast into the negative, but in the case of this image where there's a lot of bright glaring areas and then dark areas, I think improves a little bit here, the clouds especially, and some in the darker areas. Okay, clarity, I'm just going to bump that up, and hopes to increase the clouds visibility even more. Okay, you saw it kind of, it might be a little bit hard of an edge along the mountain range, but I think we'll just live with that. And also brought the clouds out a little, just that much more. Okay, so I think that's pretty much how I'm going to start it. I don't know, maybe I could bump the contrast up a little bit more. I'll tweak this more when I bring it into Photoshop itself. This is just the, keep in mind again, the kind of intro area when you're still having the raw format. Okay, going over to sharpening. This icon there is sharpening or detail, and it's best viewed at 100% when you're tweaking the sharpening. And this is kind of a fuzzy mountain range, so if I bump this all the way up in the detail, well, not all the way up, but, you know, quite a ways up, I'm going to increase the radius in this case. Each photo is different, but so this might look, you know, almost pretty good actually. I don't know how it looks on your screen with the recording, but I like to have my images usually pretty sharp, sometimes, you know, sharper than most people might like. You have to keep in mind, even just because it's nice and sharp in this fuzzy mountain region back here, you might be sharpening it too much in the foreground. That's why I'm kind of bringing it down here, looking at the foreground. And yeah, it's kind of looking ridiculous here, at least on my screen. It's too sharp as far as the foreground is concerned. So I'm going to bump this back down. You can also, well, a second ago, you can kind of see almost a white glow around the trees. There's so much over sharpening, so I'm going to reduce that. Okay, that's better. Some other options you have are to mask. I could have, kept it bumped all the way up and then maybe applied some masking there, but I usually don't like to do that because it takes away detail, and I'd rather keep that detail and just reduce the sharpening. It seems to work better. Usually there are some exceptions. I've had, when I was taking a picture of the night sky, and some of the blacks were if you have a higher ISO, say you had it at 3200 ISO, you're going to have some hot spots and everything, and then you might want to apply some masking maybe. Well, that looks pretty good. I could tweak it forever, but you can also do some masking down here. Luminance masking, I found, seems to be even more dramatic or drastic than the masking up here. I don't know if you'll see it that much right now because there's, yeah, you do. It almost looks like a painting. So I have used that in night sky, but I'm not going to use it for this. I could tweak the color more right here. As far as the color calibration, it's using the embedded profile. I'm going to zoom out again. Fit in view. Oh, one thing, keep in mind that things are slightly different. I'm on a Mac, and as you might have noticed, and especially up here, things will be a little bit different. But it's very similar. Some of the quick keys, like what you see, like right over here, are different on a Mac than a PC. I probably won't be using too many quick keys. I go back and forth between a Mac and a PC, and I kind of gets bothersome to remember which is which, but just know that those are there, and I'm on a Mac and it's a little bit different, but still very similar. Okay, as I was going to say here, I could tweak the color even further before bringing it into Photoshop itself. Notice that's very green. I'm probably not going to want to do a whole lot here because it looks pretty good already. In fact, I might bring it this direction and see what it looks like. No. Reds, there aren't a whole lot of reds. Let's look at blue. Yeah, that's kind of on that end. It's taking the green out of the trees. Let's try increasing the green, or making the yellows disappear. That is a little bit better. It might be a little too far though from reality, so maybe I'll just bump it up slightly. And let's look at the saturation. That'll probably be too much as well. Well, no, it's not too bad. Maybe I'll just increase it a little bit. And the reds, let's see if it makes this cliff a little bit more red hued in saturation. I think we need to go this direction. That made it more yellow. Well, it's redder, but we need to increase the saturation there, down here. Okay, let's bring that back a little more. Pretty good. And that's a little too much. Okay, that is reasonably good. There are other things you can do in here, lens corrections. I don't know if we had any color aberrations, color fringing, chromatic aberrations. Let's look at these trees. This is where it would show up if, when you have trees backed by light or something like that. Okay, that is there. There's a little bit there, so I'm going to zoom in that much more. So you can see there is some cyan fringing right here, and you can't see this unless you're blowing this up to a fairly large size print. Then it does become noticeable. Okay, that got rid of a lot of it. Let's see. It's just kind of shifting it along. So notice if you shift it too far, then you start seeing the red fringe. Okay, right about there is pretty good happy medium, maybe right there. Then let's just glance at the blue-yellow fringing. Well, that is reasonably good. So I think we'll just leave it at that. And zoom out again, fit in view. You could also apply vignetting, which I won't really do here, but I'm just showing you, or leave it that way, but I just wanted to show you that it's an option. So say for instance you had vignetting, in other words you had kind of a dark, subtle dark edges or circular. Here I can show you on the other end. Okay, notice how it's kind of dark around the edges. Sometimes some lenses, if they aren't made for a digital camera, they might do that. You could also be doing that on purpose. Sometimes you try to make your camera look like an old-time photograph maybe, and that's one thing you could do. One of the steps to make it look older, you can apply vignette around the edges. You could even, let's see, oh never mind. So I just wanted to show that I was pretty happy with the way the lens was already, so I'll just leave it at around 0. What other options? Oh, presets. Let's say for instance I like all of these settings that I just applied, and say I have a set of photos that are very similar. I could apply very similar settings to them. Say I had a lot of mountain pictures from this exact same scene. That would be ideal to use in such situation, use presets. So I could go here and say save settings. Notice I clicked right up here in the upper right hand corner. Save settings, and then I could leave checkmarked whatever settings I wanted to apply. If, say for instance, the next photo I want to change the contrast or clarity, I can uncheck that. I want to calibrate that manually, but I usually just leave them all checked. Then you would click save, and then well, we'll just do that, and then it saves it in a folder here, and you can name it whatever you want. I'm not going to save these settings, but when you save them, then you can pull them up right here. See, here's the preset tab or icon. And then you can see some of the presets that I've used in the past. I was experimenting with fireworks settings, had a set of those there, and then the Milky Way, I took a picture of the Milky Way and had different versions of what I thought were working, and just applied those. I kept kind of evolving with how I was adjusting the darkness and lightness and the color range, what have you. Mountain scenes, portraits, and so on and so forth. And that can save you time, applying a preset, especially if you have a set of images. Okay, just getting a sip of water. Adobe Lightroom, I believe, is another tool that you can use to apply, things to sets of images to save time. So just so Thought I would mention that. Okay, it kind of helps streamline your workflow. Split toning, just some more things you can do. You can do this something very similar in Photoshop. It's with your Photoshop controls later on. I usually don't tweak this very much, or if at all. Usually I don't even touch it. It's adjusting the highlights. Say for instance, I want to get rid of the saturation in my highlights. Maybe I want the whites to be very white. Actually, the saturation is already gone. Alright, let's say I bumped it up. It would make it the whites so they weren't as true a white. Okay, in that case it made it very red. Okay, now they're very blue. Or if I reduce the saturation... Hold on, I'm going to test something here. So looking at the snow, it looks like it's slightly on the warm side, slightly yellow. Maybe I want to make it slightly blue, so I could, or less yellow, maybe even just a truer white. There, I kind of did that right there. You can see it's a little bit truer white maybe. Maybe I want it to be more yellow. I could make it warmer, just like I did right there, and bump up the saturation a bit more. So now I kind of have a sunset type look to it, maybe. Then you can do the same with the shadows. Maybe we want to make the shadows bluer now that the light areas are kind of yellow, and just kind of have a contrast between the two going on. Maybe not that much. Anyway, just some things you could do. I am not going to do it in this photo, but I'll bump the saturation all the way down again. Maybe I'll make it a little bit... No, I'm just kind of yeah, I'll just leave it the way it is. Another thing, tonal curves. I usually tweak this more later on. It's usually one of the last things I tweak in Photoshop, really. But just to show you, since we have time, and computer's not overheating. Well, yeah. Notice how kind of by default it has a dip here, and it kind of rises up here. That helps increase the contrast a little bit. And usually what I do as far as histograms, I like to put a lot of dots and have one between and one right in the center of a square, and then one on each corner, and then move it around so I have more control and it affects less of the image at once. But again, like I said, this is usually the very last thing that I will do. And everybody has their own way of working with some of these settings. But this is just the way that I do it. Notice how that kind of right up here, this is the light end, this is the darker end. I brought this down a little bit, and it's made the let's bring it back up. Made the clouds a little more, you could see they weren't washed out as much or blown out. So bringing that down, yeah, it kind of reduces the, well, that's too far, but so maybe I do want to do that just a little bit, perhaps. Alright, we'll go ahead and leave that. Anyway, that is pretty much everything here. Oh, you can also make it grainy. You can do some post-crop vignetting, which makes it look, fades out on the edges. We'll just show that really quickly. See, it's fading out on the edges, or you can make it dark, kind of like that, kind of effects. And then you can adjust the roundness. Feathering makes it less abrupt, or it makes it more gradual. Anyway, but I'm not going to do any of that. so I'll set it to 0. It can provide some interesting effects, but I wanted to keep it more realistic. You know, you might apply something like that to a wedding announcement with a nice, that type of vignette around the edges. That would be a great time to use that. Okay, open image. I've adjusted all the brightness, contrast, sharpness, whatever I wanted to do on that one. And we'll pause for just a minute. Okay, so we've gone through pretty much everything you can do with a raw image before you load it into Photoshop. It is quite an advantage. Maybe it's difficult to tell, but for instance, the sharpening I did, if I were to just bring it right into Photoshop without doing anything to it, you know, what I did that first step, and then I sharpened it using the tools in here, you know, filter, sharpen, even with the smart sharpen, which is I like because it's a little more exact. I can click more accurate and tweak it. Even then, it's not going to be as accurate or good of a sharpening as if, you know, if I didn't tweak it in that raw format state to begin with. And mainly, again, it's because there's so much more information in a raw file. At this point, I usually like to go ahead and save it right away as a TIFF file and then keep working on it. You don't have to, but at some point you want to save things before you get too far along. And I would go down here, save as, and then select here under format, scroll down to TIFF. The TIFF format, it also includes a lot of information in the file, not quite as much as the raw format, but as far as the visual information and everything, there's still a lot there. It's a good format for storage. It doesn't take up too much room compared to some older formats like what I think a BMP file. That's not used as much. It's mainly a PC format, older format. And it's not as compressed as a JPEG. It's not compressed at all, really. In fact, right here I'll click Save, and you can specify how much compression. I usually just click None. You could click LZW, that's not too much compression. Or you could even turn it to a JPEG. Usually I don't put JPEG compression in the TIFF, unless there's some weird reason I want to upload one to the internet, and I don't know, but usually I'll just save it as a JPEG if I want to save it as a JPEG. You know, you would just click Save As, and then go to JPEG right there. Embedding color profiles. I'll pause and talk about that here for a minute. Adobe RGB is actually a superior RGB version to what is called sRGB, and sRGB is what is used by the internet, by your browser online. Get a sip of water here. But that can provide a problem because if you embedded the color profile of Adobe RGB and then you upload it to the internet, it's going to strip away normally all of that color profile, and the way it reinterprets it could be not very good. It could make it a lot more dull, in other words. A way to get around that is to go here and say Save for web devices, and then it will kind of do some things, convert it to sRGB, and that is a good way to go there for uploading online. And even then with that, sometimes you'll have some colors that are kind of muted or lost, and in those cases you might want to actually manually bump up the saturation or shift the hues or what have you to adjust for that or to compensate for that. But usually, you know, this is good enough for generally speaking, unless, you know, you're matching precise colors for whatever purpose. Okay, back to the file. I'm not going to save it right now, but I wanted to show that because I normally would, but it takes time, and I've already saved this in the past. One of the first things I would do with this image is to further maybe tweak the lights and darks. I want to see if I can bring out these clouds even more so they're not washed out. The darks are plenty dark, they're maybe almost too light actually. So let's go to image adjustments and then down to shadows and highlights. That's one of the favorite things I like to use in outdoor imagery. Okay, that's a preset of whatever I had before. This image doesn't need much lightening of the dark areas, like I said. Again, this is a tool that can kind of bump up your dynamic range in a sense. You don't want to get too carried away with it because lights and darks in an image to some extent provides a dramatic effect, and you still want it to be, you want it to be accurate still, believable. You don't want it to look fake, I guess is what I'm saying. Just a mention of HDR, that's one problem with HDR. Sometimes HDR is high dynamic range, that's what that stands for, and it will, people can get carried away with that, but we'll talk about that more tomorrow. Okay, so I'm not going to tweak the shadows at all, and I am going to adjust the highlights to some extent. And sorry if I'm getting off on tangents, I kind of do that on purpose. We have a lot of time here and something comes to mind and it's worth instructing, I think, and talking about, and I might not remember it later, or I might not cover it in depth. In some cases I will cover it more in depth though, but I like to at least mention it. Alright, highlights. Right here is, as it says, the amount. Here is tonal width. If I pulled it all the way to the left, it's just going to affect only the very lightest parts. So I'll probably want to keep it down there because I just want to tweak the clouds mainly. And notice I bring up the amount, and yeah, it does kind of give me some more definition as far as the clouds aren't as washed out. I don't want to again get too carried away with it. I mean, that's starting to look shadowy now up there and doesn't look very realistic. So I'll maybe just want to tweak it slightly. So there's 35%, and I usually like to bring it down, look at it, compare what it looked like before. Yeah, I'm just going to do a very slight amount, I think. Just knock it down just slightly, maybe a bit more. So that's original, and okay, maybe right there, and it's just kind of to your own taste really. And I might bump this up a little more. This to me, well, no, maybe not. Let's, okay, preview it's before, after. Oh, it's still at 0, or at 1, sorry, for the shadow there. I was wondering why it was lightening that, and that was why it was set at 1. Radius, you can move that around sometimes. I usually keep it right around 30 because, 30 to 50 or somewhere in there, because it can kind of start looking funny if, well, let me bump this up just to demonstrate. It's not making much difference at all, it appears on this. Oh, wait a minute, okay, there's down at 30 and then up to all the way to, wait, okay, there it is. Smaller radius, I guess. Yeah, so you can see there's 18 and then 30. For most applications, around 30 is pretty good. Okay, so I'm going to also here, mid-tone contrast, you can bump that up, experiment with that. Sometimes I might increase it a little bit maybe. Color correction is actually adding color into the areas that, say for instance, there were some really black areas and some really white, and then you kind of level it out. It might look a little bit grayer where the black used to be, and this color correction will bump up the saturation in those areas that have become grayer with the absence of the black. But I'm not going to really adjust that because I don't really have any shadows I'm working with, and just a slight amount I'm tweaking anyway. It's just the clouds up there. So just, well, that's even maybe too much now that I look at it even. Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't put it back down to 13 or whatever I had it before. That's why. Alright, so that's what I'll leave it at for now. We'll, again, don't need to tweak the shadows. Click OK. And it's thinking about it. One other thing I'll mention, I had, when I was looking, or had that open, I had the advanced tools open. If you're just opening that for the first time, you might not have all those visible. So let's go to shadows and highlights again. So I have more options checked. It might look like this on yours, and that is, you know, okay, but I'd like to tweak it a little bit more. So if you want to tweak it more, you might click show more options, and I thought I should mention that. Oh, in addition, again, if you have a set of photos and they're very similar, you could actually save these settings, whatever you set here. You could click save, and just like, you know, what we did with the DNG earlier, or, you know, with the last settings, you know, you could name it, make it a preset when you save it, and then right here is where you load them. Old presets, click load, and then here's some presets, I guess, that I had before. I don't have as many for that. And then yeah, so that's the presets on the shadows and highlights. You can do presets for several. Oops, I think I clicked that I wanted to use those, which I didn't. Anyway, you can do presets on several different things. Not all of them, unfortunately. Some of the older tools in Photoshop can't seem to. Let's undo that. I could also fade that if I wanted to. Let's just show that for a second. So say I really did want to keep these, but I wanted to have it a lot less. I could reduce the opacity of that effect that I just applied. So I could say it's at 9% now. Here's preview, and then there's, you know, before and after. Mode's normal. We won't get into that right now, but we'll deal with those type of things later. Anyway, I don't want to keep that. There was the fade, whatever effect you applied last, right there. Okay, let's step backwards. I didn't want to do that. Okay, maybe I want to. Another tool I like to use a lot is selective color. Let's just compare that really quickly with. We're gonna actually, I think. Hold on, before I go to that, I'm gonna cut this recording, and then we'll see you on the other side. It's been over 30 minutes, and I want to keep those recordings fairly brief.